I enjoy a lot of what Pete McConvill has to say about watches. And in a recent video, he shared some of his thoughts about watch brand positioning in an attempt to give his audience a toolkit for better understanding brand positioning. In this video, I'm going to use some of his slides and summarize some of what he said, adapting the framework to my way of thinking and to my mood. If you have the time, I think it's nevertheless worth watching Pete McConvill's video yourself and listening to what he has to say firsthand. Essentially, McConvill adopts an article he found on the web by brand consultancy Tomango, which breaks all luxury products into 4 categories. And he borrows and adapts the same structure specifically for watches. McConvill describes premium as products that provide the best features and specifications and also the best value. In his view, they're primarily product-focused, with little focus on identity, representation, history, heritage, or authenticity. Christopher Ward fits into this category. Isn't this a good watch for the money? Many micro brands also occupy this space. Prestige brands are all about the image of the owner, and those brands tend to spend a lot of money on marketing. McConvill identifies Rolex, Audemars Piguet, and Richard Mille as examples of prestige brands. The connoisseur brands are for the insider. This is about special insights or revelations. It's very Justin Hast. They're brands that aren't necessarily well known or popular except for those inside the industry. And if they are well known, it's for their excellence. McConvill gives the example of Jaeger LeCoultre being an example of the connoisseur brand, and their tagline as being the watchmaker of watchmakers. Luxury brands don't exist to meet a need or to solve a problem. Luxury customers aren't so interested in value for money. They want to know about the brand's heritage and uniqueness. It's worth noting that McConvill points out that this doesn't mean that price doesn't matter, just that it's only got to be reasonable and not a feature. McConvill puts Patek Philippe in this category alongside most other Swiss watch brands. He describes luxury brands as being all about the feels, and that it doesn't matter what the feelings are, but it's all about the feels. I rather liked the way Pete McConvill presented his thoughts for watch branding. I found it interesting, and arguably it helps to explain a couple of things for me personally. Namely, the reasons why we buy watches, and more specifically why I bought the watches I own. And secondly, why I choose to wear certain watches on any given day or from one moment to the next. Again, for me, this is partly linked to why I bought my watches in the first place. And that links back to how and why the watch brands market themselves in the way that they do. Because ultimately they're in sales. So I thought I'd use this same framework to share my own watch buying motivations and also to explain my personal choices when it comes to deciding which watch I might wear on any given day. Watching or listening to this, you might find similarities with your own watch purchases and perhaps like me, why and when you decide to wear a particular watch. I'd be interested to hear whether this positioning makes sense to you and if it impacts your own behavior. It's important to say up front that this is not intended to be scientific. My approach to this is a bit more practical than that, and it's very subjective, so not to be strictly adhered to. However, I felt that this positioning was like opening a window into my mindset when it comes to my watch enthusiasm, and is an interesting way to get a handle on my buying and wearing habits. In this way, I hope this video will be helpful to you too. So I'm going to begin by categorizing some of my watches using the broad framework McConvill has provided, and then reflect on how my behaviors have evolved and changed and perhaps not changed at all. So in the premium category, I now own 3 G-Shocks, 2 Casioks, and this one, all of which are obvious premium choices. They have lots of features and represent superb value. I also own a Christopher Ward, the 12, and a Pink Lemonade by Studio Underdog, which fit in this premium category. I might have included my William Wood red watch in this category, but I haven't, because I think it fits better in the luxury category. As I say, this is subjective, and yet this premium category was probably one of the easiest for me to decide on where my watches fit. Connoisseur was the next most straightforward category within which I could place my watches. It's easy to put my two Grand Seiko watches here, my SBGY003 Spring Drive and also my newest purchase, the Grand Seiko SBGW301. Then my two JLC watches, the Reverso, medium, duo, small seconds, and my limited edition Master Control Date. I also find myself putting this Casio into this category. It's a watch that my father-in-law gifted me, alongside these two vintage watches from my own father. This vintage Vacheron and Constantin, and this Piaget, which is one of only 6 watches ever made. My decision to buy the Rolex Oyster Quartz was for me a connoisseur-driven purchase. For me, it harks back to what this watch represents and is my piece of history dating back to the quartz crisis. Arguably, all my Lange watches fit here in the connoisseur category too. However, for me there's a blurring of lines here with the luxury segment. The Zeitwerk fits in the connoisseur 100%. It's a marvel of technology, as for me does mostly my Lange 1. However, when I think of my Saxonia Thin, I rather find myself putting that watch into the luxury category first, alongside my Odysseus, although it could be argued that they both firmly belong in the connoisseur category too, and in the prestige as well, as perhaps does my Lange 1. And that touches on something that I will come back to later, which is why I decide to wear a watch on any given day. Prestige. I don't believe I have that many watches that fit in the prestige category. McConvill suggests that the Rolex brand belongs here, and looking back, that's a large part of the reason why I bought my Rolex GMT Master 2 as a young man in 1990. Back then, for me it was mostly about image. Supposedly, my Cartier Roadster also fits here. However, for me it's probably better positioned in the luxury category, because it's all about the feels, and there were in part specific emotional reasons rooted in why I made the purchase in the first place. Essentially, I thought it would be fun to be watch twins with my wife, who owned a smaller version of the same watch. More blurring of the lines when it comes to purchase and wearing habits here. I'm not so certain about my Rolex Explorer 1, which I haven't ever regarded as a flex or prestige watch, but more a luxury purchase, given the definitions we're adhering to. Again, I know that in his video, McConville's talking about watch brands, and I'm now shifting the application of this framework to watch purchasing and wearing habits. In fact, I like the Explorer precisely because it flies under the radar. Arguably, my Bremonts fit in prestige too. There is certainly a prestige element for me anyway. For me, Bremont, a new watch brand with a bold vision, represented a more discerning consumer than so many of those who sport the more obvious big brands like Rolex and AP and Richard Mille. And on that basis, my Bremonts from the Nick and Giles era were all luxury purchases. Whilst for me there is also a prestige element to my Bremont watches too, if luxury brands are all about the feelings they inspire in the customer, then Bremont sits, or should I say, sat, firmly in the luxury category. Again, I'm referring to the Bremont watches that I bought and own from the Bremont brand of yesteryear. I'm not sure that the new Bremont brand of today holds the same appeal at all, which I believe helps to explain the identity crisis that the Bremont brand appears to be facing currently, certainly since their April 2024 Watches and Wonders appearance. For example, if we try applying the framework to the Bremont brand of today, is Bremont prestige? Well, I don't believe so, but perhaps it's trying to be. Is it connoisseur? No. Premium? I don't believe so. I think they've got their pricing wrong. Luxury? Not for me. Bremont have become yet another watch brand that's leaning on a series of of ambassadors to provide meaning, having lost their marketing magic to penmaker Yard Lead and Moke International. So, where does the new Bremont brand sit? It's not immediately obvious to me, which might be part of the problem. Do share your thoughts. For me, my PAM 512 Panerai Radiomir is luxury, and as is my William Wood red watch. My Omega Speedmaster Professional, the Moonwatch, also sits here in luxury, although I fully appreciate that you could make an argument for this watch to appear in the prestige category and perhaps even in the premium and connoisseur categories too. Perhaps that's why sales of the Speedy are so good. The watch seems to tick so many different boxes for so many different people. So for me, the Moonwatch does sort of sit right in the middle of this Venn diagram. Which brings me onto something that McConvill asserts in his video, that connoisseur and prestige never overlap, nor do luxury and premium as far as brands are concerned. Well, for me, I think they do occasionally overlap, and the Moonwatch is a really good case in point to challenge this. Not to mention the overlap that occurs for me when it comes to wearing watches. For example, in April, when I went to Watches and Wonders in Geneva, I wondered which watch I should wear for those 2 days. It had to be the Lange one, I thought, not least because I was a guest of A. Lange & Söhne, and because this was the watch show of the year. I wanted to fit in and be true to my inner enthusiast. My Lange 1 for me represents both connoisseur and prestige, mostly because of the context of where I was, as well as luxury. When it comes to wearing a watch, another example of this overlap occurred when I visited IWC at their London Bond Street boutique for a private event one evening. Which is the appropriate watch to wear? Well, I don't own an IWC yet, so that evening I wore my Saxonia Thin, because for me it represented the connoisseur, but also, in a low-key way, prestige. Anyway, that's what came to me at the time. The same can be said when it comes to overlap in the premium and luxury categories too. Again, I'm referring to the wearing experience here. For me, Christopher Ward is firmly in the premium category, and I often opt to wear the 12 when I regard it to be inappropriate for me to wear a Rolex or a Lange, for example. Or perhaps when I don't feel it would be sensible or safe. Wearing the 12, I feel that I can de-risk when it might not feel safe and yet still enjoy some level of horology. Yes, one could argue that Christopher Ward doesn't belong in the luxury category. However, I think that's a matter of context, and at the end of the day, it is partly a luxury watch in my book. Again, it's all about the feelings. Of course, I accept that the 12 is a very different sort of luxury watch from some of my other luxury watches, but as I say, I believe this is still a luxury watch given the definition. I accept that my own feelings towards the 12 are perhaps not the same as how others might feel towards the watch, or indeed my other watches. And on that basis, I'd invite you to share where, in this framework, you see the 12 best positioned and why. McConvill caveats what he says by saying, you may buy a watch for a different reason or despite positioning. And I suppose I ought to caveat similarly when I say that you might wear a watch for a different reason or despite the positioning. Mostly, I find that I buy watches based on how I feel about a timepiece. I'm often impulsive, and yet at other times I'm far more considered. My Zeitwerk was very much a connoisseur purchase. My Pink Lemonade was a premium purchase. My Bremonts were mainly luxury, but also prestige, and for me, the Red Watch was a luxury purchase in spite of it being one of my more affordable acquisitions. I tend to flit around these categories when deciding which watch I'm going to wear, and quite often this behaviour and my choices are linked to my mood. I suppose that also explains why most of my watches were luxury purchases, being driven by the feels. Sometimes what I choose to wear is a choice driven by what I'm physically or practically doing on a particular day, and other times It's more about fashion and prestige, or quietly indulging the inner watch geek. That my watch enthusiasm moves fluidly and easily from one mindset to another, and then back around again, over and again, I think explains why on my watch journey I began with a mainly prestige purchase 30-something years ago. Over that time, I increasingly came to appreciate my GMT Master 2's functionality, or premium value, the functional date window and the GMT hand. The luxury aspect or feeling towards that same watch grew over time, and it was subsequently the feelings I associated with the Bremont brand that saw me buying into Bremont watches and then wearing my Bremonts in preference to my Rolex for the most part thereafter. Since then, my buying habits have moved around the luxury segment, shifted into the connoisseur category, and then more recently dipped in and out of the premium space with my Christopher Ward Studio Underdog and G-Shock purchases. Wearing these watches takes me on the journey back and forth, around both ways, and then back again. Anyway, I hope that you find this a helpful way to look at your own purchasing and wearing habits. Do please share your thoughts in the comments section.